The leg was broken in 3 places. Maren Voss knew this before she cut the flight suit open, because the angle of the shin below the knee was the kind of angle that only happened when something had gone catastrophically wrong with the basic physics of a human body. She'd seen it before. She'd seen worse. What she hadn't seen before was the alien's hand. The alien was still alive. That was the first surprise. The second was that it was a female, or what the briefings described as a female configuration, the secondary thoracic plate softer, the chromatic nodes along the collar ridge cycling through pale blue rather than the amber that the combat pattern males ran. The Veth. That was the name Command had given them, though Command had given them a lot of names in the 18 months since first contact, and most of those names had been wrong. She lay 6 meters from where the dropship had come down, partially buried under a collapsed support strut, her upper body free, her lower body not. One of her 4 limbs was pinned at what Maren's field training recognized immediately as a fracture, same angle, same catastrophic physics as the human woman she was kneeling over. The alien's chromatic nodes pulsed once, faint, struggling. She was watching Maren with the flat compound eyes the Veth used for low-light vision. 3 other eyes, the high-frequency pair and the single ranging eye in the center of the forehead, were closed. She was conserving. She was hurt and she knew it, and she was doing exactly what a trained soldier did when the body started to fail. She was rationing what was left. Maren went back to Corporal Adiz, Nwasu's leg. "You're doing great," she said, which was a lie. Adiz had passed out twice in the last 4 minutes, and the third time she wasn't going to come back the same way. The fracture had nicked the perineal artery, not severed, not yet, but the bruising said it was close. Maren had field splinted worse in worse conditions, but she'd had her full kit then, and a stable surface, and no ongoing weapons discharge 300 meters to the north. The discharge had been ongoing for 11 minutes. She worked fast. Her hands knew what to do even when her brain was still cataloging threats. The traction splint unfolded from her thigh pouch by feel, the strap seated in the right channels, the ankle hitch tightened in the specific sequence that didn't torque the brake further. Adiz made a sound that wasn't a word. Maren put one hand flat on her sternum. "Stay with me. I need you to stay with me for about 90 more seconds." "The Veth," Adiz said. Her voice was thick. "I see her." "She's not." "I see her." Maren tightened the last strap, checked the distal pulse at the ankle with 2 fingers present, weak, present, and sat back on her heels. The traction splint wasn't what Adiz needed. What Adiz needed was a surgical bay and 3 units of O-negative and 4 days off her feet. What she had was Maren, a field kit, and a dropship that was on fire 30 meters away. The alien made a sound. It wasn't language, not the structured tonal language the briefings had spent 40 slides describing. It was lower than that, something that came from the thoracic cavity rather than the vocal apparatus, a low cycling hum that shifted frequency twice and then stopped. Maren had heard a sound like it exactly once before, on a recording from the Gallipoli station engagement. The sound a Veth soldier made when it was past pain and moving into what the xenobiologists cautiously called the passage resonance, which was their careful academic way of saying the sound they made when they were dying. She looked at the alien's pinned limb. She looked at the strut. She looked at her own hands. She had enough traction splint material for one more application. There was no tactical reason to use it on an enemy combatant. There was no standing order that covered this situation. There was no one watching and no one to ask. There was just Maren Voss, 29 years old, field medic, 3rd rotation, kneeling in the wreckage of a dropship engagement on a moon that didn't have a name yet, and an alien soldier who was making the sound that meant the end. She crossed the 6 meters on her knees. Up close, the Veth soldier smelled like copper and something herbal, something almost like crushed grass. The compound eyes tracked her movement with the particular smooth fluidity that Maren had learned to read, not threat assessment, not the hard-edged angular tracking the Veth used when they were targeting. This was something else. This was the tracking of something that no longer had the resources for aggression. "I'm going to move the strut," Marin said. She said it in standard, which the Veth didn't speak, because she'd found in 3 rotations that the tone of a voice carried across the species barrier even when the words didn't. She kept her voice the way she'd learned to keep it, low, even, no sharp edges. "This is going to hurt. I need you to hold still." The alien blinked 2 of its eyes. The chromatic nodes along its collar ridge cycled through a color Marin had never seen in the briefings, a deep violet that shifted towards silver and back. There was no notation for it in the Veth behavioral compendium. She filed it in the back of her mind and got her hands on the strut. It took 4 attempts. The strut was part of the dropship's dorsal spine, half a meter in diameter, and it had come down at an angle that gave her almost no leverage. Her shoulder screamed at her. On the 3rd attempt, something popped in her lower back that she made a deliberate decision not to think about. On the 4th attempt, the strut shifted, grinding, and the alien made a sound that was pure, unfiltered pain, and then the limb was free. The fracture was bad. Different anatomy, different bone structure. The Veth didn't have a tibia and fibula. They had a single weight-bearing strut wrapped in a helical secondary structure that distributed load differently. But the principles were the same. The limb needed stabilization. Without it, the jagged edge of the broken strut bone would continue working against the surrounding tissue and eventually hit something that mattered. Marin used her last splint. She was halfway through the application when the alien's upper limb, the forward pair, the ones the Veth used for fine manipulation, reached across and settled on her hand. She stopped. The alien's limb was longer than a human arm, jointed differently, the terminal manipulators more numerous and thinner than fingers. The grip was not tight. It was not threatening. It was the grip of something that had run out of options and found the only anchor left available. Marin looked at the hand on her hand. Then she finished applying the splint. She didn't pull her hand away. She wasn't sure why. Later, trying to reconstruct the reasoning for the incident report she suspected she'd be required to file, she couldn't find a clean professional logic for it. The tactical situation hadn't changed. The splint was complete. Her patient, her actual patient, Corporal Adiz Nwasu, was stable and unconscious and not going anywhere. The northern engagement was ongoing but no closer. There was no operational reason to sit in the wreckage of a crashed dropship on an unnamed moon, holding the hand of an enemy combatant. She stayed anyway. The alien's chromatic nodes cycled through the unknown violet-silver again. Then, slowly, they shifted to something new, a warm amber that was nothing like the combat amber, softer and more diffuse. The way firelight was different from the directed beam of a tactical light, even though both were technically the same phenomenon. The passage resonance hum had stopped. The alien was breathing, whatever the Veth equivalent of breathing was, the thoracic bellows motion that oxygenated their secondary circulatory system, in a rhythm that had stabilized. Not dying, not actively dying. Marin's comm crackled. Voss, respond. Static, then, Marin, if you're alive, respond. We've got a window in about 6 minutes before the eastern flank collapses, and I genuinely need to know if you're alive. She keyed her comm with her free hand. Alive, 2 casualties, 1 mobile, 1 not. The corporal. Stabilized, she needs a vac. Who's the other? Marin looked at the alien's hand on her hand. Complicated, she said. A pause. Then Sergeant First Class Teodoro Ibarra's voice, which had been the steadiest thing in her operational world for 14 months, did something she had never heard it do before. It hesitated. Marin. She stabilized, Marin said. I used my last splint. Another pause, longer. 6 minutes, Ibarra said finally. Be at the extraction point. The comm cut. Marin looked at the alien. The alien looked at Marin with its low-light compound eyes, The other three closed, the chromatic nodes holding that warm amber. She became aware of something she had no framework for. The alien's grip on her hand had not tightened since it first made contact. It had not loosened either. It was holding the exact same pressure, as if whatever calculation the alien's nervous system was running had found a precise value and locked onto it. Maren thought about the passage resonance hum. She thought about the way it had stopped. She had a theory that she didn't have time to fully form. She filed it in the same place she'd filed the unknown color. "I have to go," she said. She said it in standard, low and even. "I'm going to come back. I don't know if you understand that. I'm going to try to come back." She uncoupled her hand from the alien's grip. The alien did not reach for her again. It lay in the wreckage, limbs splinted, nodes cycling amber, and watched her go. The thing command didn't tell you, Maren had found, was how much of the war was administrative. She filed 4 reports in the 72 hours after the dropship engagement. The incident report for the Veth medical intervention, a supplemental on Corporal Nwasu's condition and prognosis, a material request for replacement splint inventory, and a 4th report, which she had to request a special form for, labeled simply XENO medical contact, unsanctioned, which turned out to be a form so rarely filed that the digital version had a formatting error in Section 3B that no one had ever bothered to correct. She filed them all. She waited. On the 4th day, a captain she'd never met summoned her to a briefing room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and told her that the Veth soldier she'd treated had been recovered by a Veth retrieval unit approximately 40 minutes after extraction. This was not unusual. The Veth were meticulous about their dead, and it turned out, equally meticulous about their injured. What was unusual was what the retrieval unit had left behind. The captain slid a sealed specimen container across the table. Inside was a small object, roughly ovoid, matte black, covered in a geometric pattern that the surface analysis lab had spent 2 days failing to fully map. It had been placed with deliberate precision beside the spot where the Veth soldier had been lying. Not dropped, placed. "Any idea what it is?" the captain asked. "No," Maren said. "Neither does anyone else." The captain looked at the container for a moment. "They're calling it a token, lack of better terminology." Maren looked at the geometric pattern. She thought about the warm amber of the chromatic nodes. She thought about a grip that had found a precise value and locked onto it. "There's a proposal," the captain said, "from the xenobiology team. They want to attempt a controlled contact scenario, using you." "Why me?" "Because you're the only human the relevant Veth soldier has allowed within 3 meters without an aggressive response since recovery." The captain paused. "She's refusing medical treatment from Veth personnel. She's refusing food. She's been in their equivalent of a medical bay for 4 days, and she's been awake for all of it, facing the direction of our position, which the retrieval unit found alarming enough to flag." Maren looked at the container. "Waiting," she said. "That's the working theory." She picked up the specimen container. The object inside shifted slightly, and for just a moment the geometric pattern caught the light differently. The same way that the chromatic nodes had caught it, the warm amber that was nothing like the combat color. "I'll do it," she said. The contact scenario took 3 weeks to arrange, which was 3 weeks of forms and protocols, and a legal review from the Judge Advocate's office that produced a 17-page document about the Geneva Conventions and their applicability to non-terrestrial sapient species, which concluded, not helpfully, that the situation was unprecedented. Maren spent the 3 weeks reading everything the xenobiology team had on Veth neurology. It was not a lot. Most of what the xenobiology team had was inference, pulled from combat behavior patterns and the very few specimens who had died under circumstances where the body could be recovered and examined. The Veth were meticulous about this too. They did not leave bodies. The fact that the field team had any anatomical data at all was testament to the specific chaos of certain engagements where retrieval had been impossible on both sides. What the xenobiology team had concluded, with the careful hedging of scientists working from insufficient data, was this: the Veth operated on a dual neural architecture. One system handled the functions that any sufficiently complex nervous system handled: motor control, sensory processing, threat assessment, the mechanics of being a body in the world. The second system was something else, something they called the resonance network. The resonance network was distributed, not just through the brain, through the entire body, concentrated along the surface tissues, particularly the manipulator limbs. It was, as best the xenobiologists could tell, a system for what they carefully called collective attunement. The way the Veth maintained group cohesion across distances, the way Veth units in combat moved with a coordination that went beyond any trained doctrine, the way a Veth patrol of 12 individuals could function with the decisiveness of a single organism. It was also, the xenobiologists noted in footnote 17, theorized to be the substrate for the passage resonance phenomenon. The hum that happened when a Veth soldier was dying was not vocalization in the traditional sense. It was the resonance network broadcasting, reaching, the xenobiologist had written, somewhat unscientifically, for connection. Marin read footnote 17 4 times. She thought about a grip that found a precise value and locked onto it. She thought about the passage resonance hum stopping. She understood then what she had done without meaning to. She had not merely stabilized a fracture. She had answered a broadcast. The contact location was a prefabricated structure on the border of the neutral zone that had been erected so quickly it still smelled of sealant. 4 xenobiologists, 2 military observers, a linguist, and a medical officer were arranged in a monitoring room with a one-way interface panel. Marin was alone in the contact room. The Veth soldier came in from the opposite side. She was moving without obvious difficulty, which meant the fracture had healed in 3 weeks faster than human bone, consistent with the xenobiological notes on Veth recovery rates. She wore no equipment, no armor, no weapons, none of the ceramic plating that the Veth used as secondary protection in combat. She was, in the terminology of the briefings, presenting as non-combatant. Her chromatic nodes, when she saw Marin, shifted immediately to the warm amber. Marin had brought the specimen container. She held it out, the way you offered something to anyone when you wanted them to understand that you were giving it back rather than surrendering it. The alien crossed the room in 4 of her long, fluid strides and took the container from Marin's hands. Her manipulators brushed Marin's fingers in the transfer, brief, specific, the same precise grip pressure as the wreckage, not grasping, touching. Then she set the container down on the floor between them, and she looked at Marin with the flat compound eyes, and she made a sound. Not the passage resonance hum, not the structured tonal language. Something between the two, a frequency pattern that repeated and varied, in a way that the linguist in the monitoring room later described as clearly communicative, but entirely outside any mapped phonemic range. The xenobiologists called it a novel vocalization. Marin listened to it for a full 30 seconds. Then she hummed back. She had no conscious plan for this. It was the same instinct that had made her stay with her hand in the alien's grip, the instinct that said when something is trying to reach you, you reach back. She picked a tone near the center of what she'd heard and she hummed it, varied it slightly the way the alien had varied it, let it cycle. The sound felt strange in her own chest, resonant in a way her usual voice wasn't. The Veth soldier went completely still. The chromatic nodes along her collar ridge blazed the warm amber, but intense now, saturated, nothing diffuse about it. The 3 closed eyes opened. All 6 eyes were oriented on Marin with a focus that the monitoring room, she later learned, had identified as threat assessment, and then rapidly reclassified when the alien's combat posture failed to follow. She reached across the space between them and put her manipulators on Marin's hand. The same grip, the same precise value. Marin kept humming. Contact with the Veth soldier. The xenobiology team named her subject Resonance 1, and Marin privately called her Ve, which was as close as she'd gotten to a phonemic representation of the first sound the alien had made directly to her, did not end the war. Marin was under no illusion that it would. Wars were not ended by two individuals holding hands in a prefabricated contact room on a neutral zone border. Wars were ended by politics and exhaustion, and the gradual accumulation of reasons to stop, which was a process that moved at the speed of institutions. What the contact did was open a channel. The xenobiologists were careful about this. The linguist was careful. The military observers were deeply careful. Everyone was careful except Marin, who kept coming back to the contact room and kept humming and kept letting Ve's manipulators find her hand, because she was beginning to understand something that none of the careful people in the monitoring room had yet formally theorized. The resonance network was not just about collective attunement within a Veth unit. It was about something larger. The Veth's distributed neural architecture, the system that lived in the surface tissues, concentrated in the manipulators, was not a closed system. It had evolved, presumably, in an environment where connection across difference was a survival advantage. It was, at its deepest functional level, a system for finding and holding a frequency in common with whatever it encountered. Even a human. Especially it appeared a human. Because humans broadcast too. The xenobiologists had not written this down yet, because they didn't know it. Marin was working it out in the contact room, from observation, and from something less formal than observation. From the way Ve's chromatic nodes responded to her emotional state before she was fully conscious of it herself. From the way the novel vocalization the alien used with her had begun, over weeks, to correspond with specific contexts, the way a language begins before it is a language. She was working it out from the fact that the passage resonance hum had stopped when she put her hand on Ve's. From the fact that whatever the resonance network had been broadcasting into the wreckage of a crashed dropship on an unnamed moon, Marin's uncalculated, unremarkable human presence had been close enough in frequency to answer it. Humans were loud, in whatever register the Veth could hear. They'd been fighting each other for 18 months, without either species knowing this. The war had a shape, Marin had learned from the briefings. It had a shape the way all wars had shapes, not the clean geometric shapes of military doctrine, but the ragged biological shapes of things that grew and spread according to conditions rather than plans. It had begun as territorial. The Veth had a word for the concept that the linguist had translated as something between sovereignty and resonance field, and the expansion of human colonial settlements into certain spatial regions had violated it in ways that neither side had understood in time to prevent the first exchange of fire. It had grown from there. 18 months, 14 major engagements, 3 stations lost, 2 Veth population centers struck in ways that the after-action reports classified as proportionate response, and that Marin, reading them in the small hours, classified as the kind of thing that made peace harder. 712 human dead. Veth casualties unknown, because the Veth took their dead, and the xenobiologists were still calibrating their sensor interpretation. 712. She knew some of those names. Most of the medics knew most of the names, because that was the nature of the work. You knew the ones you couldn't save better than you knew the ones you could. She thought about this in the contact room, sitting with Ve's manipulators on her hand and the warm amber of the chromatic nodes cycling in the dim light. She thought about what it meant that 2 nervous systems could find a common frequency across 17 months of killing. She thought about what that implied about what had been possible before the killing started. Ve made the novel vocalization, the one that had come over weeks to mean something close to, "I see you." Marin hummed the response she developed for it, the one that had come to mean something close to, "I see you too." The monitoring room was quiet behind the one-way panel. The breakthrough, when it came from the wrong direction. Not from the contact sessions. Not from the linguist's work, which was painstaking and careful and proceeding at the pace that real linguistic mapping required. Not from the xenobiologist's revised models of Veth neural architecture, which were genuinely exciting science but months from practical application. It came from Corporal Adiz Nwasu, who had been recovered, repaired, and returned to limited duty, and who came to find Marin in the contact room's preparation area 3 months after the initial engagement, with an expression that combined profound discomfort with the look of someone who has run out of options for not saying a thing. "I've been talking to the Zenobio team," Adiz said. "I know, I've seen your name in the consultation logs. Did you know that the Veth retrieval unit that recovered Ve?" Adiz said the name with the careful respect of someone using another person's naming convention even when it wasn't the official one, which was one of the things Marin had always liked about her, left more than the token. Marin waited. They left a pattern, pressed into the ground around the token. Adiz held out a scan. The surface analysis team thought it was debris impact at first, took 3 months to figure out it wasn't random. Marin looked at the scan. The pattern was geometric, complex, organized around a central point. It was also immediately recognizable as structured in the same way as the object inside the token container, the same underlying grammar, the same distribution of elements. It was the same language, not the tonal spoken language the linguist was mapping, something older, something that lived below language. "Zenobio thinks it's coordinates," Adiz said. "Not spatial coordinates, something else. They're calling it a resonance address. A location in," she paused, choosing words with clear discomfort, "whatever spatial framework the resonance network uses." Marin looked at the pattern. She thought about a distributed neural architecture that was not a closed system. She thought about a system that had evolved to find and hold a common frequency with whatever it encountered. She thought about 2 species spending 18 months killing each other while broadcasting at each other on a channel neither side had known existed. "They want to try to use it," Adiz said. "The resonance address. They think it might be, the Zenobio team thinks it might be a location that's accessible through the contact sessions. Through," another pause, "through what you and Ve have been doing. Through the hand contact. Through the hand contact." Marin handed the scan back. "Show me the model," she said. The model was extraordinary and deeply incomplete, which was the only kind of model that the current state of understanding permitted. The xenobiology team presented it over 2 hours with the careful hedging of people who knew that their evidence was solid and their extrapolations were not. The core of it was this. The Veth resonance network was not merely intraspecies. It had never been merely intraspecies. It had evolved in an environment of genuine multispecies complexity, on a home world that the xenobiologists were slowly mapping from behavioral inference, and it had evolved to do what nervous systems evolve to do, model the world accurately enough to survive in it. For the Veth, accurate modeling required accurate resonance with whatever you were in proximity to. The resonance network was, at its functional core, an empathy engine. The AI species, Command called them the choir, though this was another name that was probably wrong, were different. The xenobiologists had very little data on the choir because the choir did not fight in ways that left evidence behind. What they had concluded from the engagement records and the 3 recovered choir artifacts was that the choir operated on a principle of resonance suppression, where the Veth resonance network broadcast outward, seeking attunement, the choir broadcast inward, maintaining a closed harmonic that excluded interference. The war was not, the xenobiologists now believed, primarily a territorial dispute between humans and the Veth. The war was interference. The choir had been running a suppression campaign across this spatial region for what their artifact dating suggested was somewhere between 40 and 60 years. The campaign was not military in the conventional sense. It was more like the xenobiologist who presented this section of the model visibly struggled with the analogy static. Broadcast static on the frequencies the Veth resonance network used for long-range attunement, degrading the signal, creating the conditions in which a species that navigated the world through resonance would encounter a new species and interpret it, incorrectly, as a threat. The Veth had not started the war, the choir had. The token, the resonance address pressed into the ground, these were not gifts, in the human sense. They were something more specific. They were directions. Vey had given Marin directions to the source of the suppression signal. The xenobiologists thought the signal could be interrupted. Through the contact sessions. Through a human. Because humans, in whatever register the Veth could hear, were extraordinarily loud. You understand what they're asking, Ibara said. They were on the observation deck, the one that faced the unnamed moon's surface, the gray-brown expanse of it rolling away in the dim light of the distant star. Marin had always found it oddly peaceful here, which probably said something about her psychological profile that she preferred not to examine. They want me to navigate to a location within the Veth resonance network, Marin said, using Vey's hand contact as the interface, and then broadcast. Broadcast what? Whatever I broadcast. She looked at the surface. They think the human neural signal is chaotic enough on the choir's frequency range to disrupt the suppression. They think it's been disrupting it locally, in the contact sessions, in the wreckage, that day, and that if I can get close enough to the source node. You could crash it, Ibara said. The xenobiologists say disrupt. They're not sure about crash. But you are. Marin thought about the day in the wreckage. She thought about what it had felt like when the passage resonance hum stopped. She thought about a system that had run out of options and found the only anchor available, and the precise, locked value of that grip, and what it had meant that her presence had been close enough in frequency to answer a signal she hadn't known she was receiving. I think, she said carefully, that the human nervous system is noisier than anything the choir modeled for. I think they built a suppression architecture for the Veth, and it was working fine for 40 or 60 years, and then humanity arrived and we were loud, in all the wrong frequencies, chaotically loud, and I think that's been degrading their system since we got here, and I think Vey figured that out before the xenobiologists did, and I think the token and the address were Vey's way of saying, push harder. Ibara was quiet for a long time. The Veth commander has communicated through the contact channel, he said finally. They're offering a temporary ceasefire for the operation window. That's Marin. The Veth don't do temporary ceasefires. The Veth don't acknowledge ceasefire as a concept. The linguists spent 6 hours working out what they were actually saying, because the concept didn't have a direct translation. What does it translate to? Ibara looked at the surface. Something like, we will hold the frequency open. Marin nodded. I'll need 6 hours, she said, with Vey. You'll have 8. The preparation was not complex, which was the xenobiologists' way of saying they didn't know what they were preparing for. What they knew. Marin would enter contact with Vey using the established hand contact protocol. Vey would navigate to the resonance address using the Veth-specific capacity for network location that the xenobiologists had mapped imperfectly over 3 months of contact sessions. Marin would, this was the part where the scientific language got vague, contribute her native neural signal to the contact, amplified, potentially, by the depth of the contact and the accumulated attunement built over 3 months of sessions. What they didn't know, what the choir suppression signal would feel like at the source, whether Marin's signal would disrupt it or merely annoy it, whether the disruption, if it happened, would be localized or cascading, whether the xenobiologist's model was right at all. The linguist came to find Marin before she went into the contact room and gave her a handwritten note on actual paper, which felt archaic and meaningful in equal measure. The note said, "There's a passage in the Veth behavioral record that translates approximately as, 'The sound that answers is the sound that saves.' I think this is about what you're doing. I thought you should know it existed." Marin folded the note and put it in her chest pocket. Vey was already in the contact room. She had been there, the monitoring team reported, for 2 hours. She had spent those 2 hours facing the door, chromatic nodes cycling amber, in the motionless focused stillness that the Veth used when the xenobiologists had mapped this one. They were holding a frequency. Waiting. When Marin came through the door, Vey moved to meet her before Marin had crossed half the room's distance. The fluid four-stride movement that covered ground without hurry. The manipulators came up and found Marin's hands, both of them this time, not just one, and the grip settled at the precise, locked value that Marin had come to know as fluently as she knew her own heartbeat. The chromatic nodes blazed amber. "Okay," Marin said, low and even, no sharp edges. "Let's go." The sensation was not what she'd expected, which was not surprising since she hadn't known what to expect. It was not visual. It was not auditory. It was the closest thing to proprioception she had a word for, a sudden, vertiginous awareness of extension, of her own nervous system reaching past its usual boundary. The way you became aware of a limb you hadn't been paying attention to except enormously larger than that, and extending in a direction that didn't have a name in any mapping system she'd studied. She felt Vey in it, not as an intrusion, as a guide, as the pilot of a vehicle Marin hadn't known she was riding in. She felt the resonance network the way you felt a room you'd walked into in the dark, by inference, by the texture of what was around her, by the echoes of her own signal returning to her changed. It was vast. It was not the Veth resonance network alone. It was the network in the context of everything the network was embedded in, a topology of signal and reception that extended in every direction and was full, densely full, of the signatures of things that broadcasted. Full except for the part that wasn't. The part that wasn't was a silence, and it was the most wrong thing Marin had ever felt. Not empty. Empty would have been natural. This was active. This was the silence of suppression, the silence of something working hard to prevent a signal from existing, the static that had been running for 40 or 60 years on frequencies that should have been full of Veth resonance, and were instead flat and dead, and held flat by something that did not want to be interrupted. She found the center of it. She didn't do anything complicated. She didn't do anything she'd been trained for or briefed on or prepared by the xenobiologists to do. She did the same thing she'd done in the wreckage of a crashed dropship when she'd heard the passage resonance hum of something running out of options. She hummed. She hummed the sound she'd been humming for 3 months in the contact room, the sound she'd developed for ICU, the sound that had grown out of Vey's novel vocalization and her own improvised response, and 3 months of daily contact sessions, and the specific, accumulated attunement of 2 nervous systems that had been finding common frequency since the day they'd been introduced by a field traction splint and a collapsed dorsal strut. It was not a complicated sound. It was just the sound of one thing reaching toward another and finding it. Into the silence of the choir's suppression field, it was apparently extremely loud. She felt the suppression architecture register her the way a wall registers an earthquake, not as a threat, but as a category of phenomenon it had not been engineered to withstand. The choir had built their suppression for Veth resonance, which was structured and harmonically predictable, and for all its complexity, operating on principles the choir had been studying for 60 years. They had not built it for the chaotic, multiband, stochastically distributed neural broadcast of a human nervous system, which was noisy in frequencies the choir hadn't mapped, operating on principles that hadn't been part of their models, anchored to the Veth resonance network through a contact that the choir's entire strategic framework had classified as impossible. The suppression field cracked. It did not crack politely or gradually. It cracked the way ice cracked when the temperature changed too fast, all at once, in fracture lines that propagated from the point of impact outward, following the internal stress patterns that had been building for 60 years of maintaining a signal that cost something to maintain. Marin felt it go. The feeling was not triumph. It was not the clean, bright sensation that the word victory implied. It was more like the feeling of setting down something very heavy, a sudden awareness of weight that had been so constant she'd stopped registering it as weight, releasing all at once. She came back to herself in the contact room with vase manipulators on both her hands, and the warm amber of the chromatic nodes, so intense it was almost white. The monitoring room was completely silent. Then someone said, "Oh my God," which was not the kind of thing xenobiologists usually said, and was also, Marin thought, probably accurate. The linguist's translation of the Veth response to the suppression collapse, which came in through the contact channel 40 minutes later, was 11 pages long and heavily annotated. The practical summary was 3 paragraphs. Marin read the practical summary. The Veth had known about the choir's suppression campaign for approximately 20 years, during which time they had been unable to locate the source node, because the choir's architecture was specifically designed to be undetectable by Veth resonance equipment. They had recognized, within the first 6 months of the human-Veth conflict, that human neural signals were doing something to the suppression field that their own signals could not. They had spent the subsequent year attempting to engineer a contact scenario that would allow them to use this property. The dropship engagement on the unnamed moon had not been planned by the Veth, but the token and the resonance address and the ceasefire that was not a ceasefire but was instead "we will hold the frequency open," these had been. They had known, from the moment Marin's hand settled on hers in the wreckage, what Marin's signal sounded like on the resonance network. She had known it the way you knew the sound of something that answers you when you are reaching in the dark for anything at all. She had held on. The war did not end immediately. Wars never did. There were still the 17-page legal documents and the territorial negotiations and the accumulated weight of 712 names and their Veth equivalents, which the Veth had sent as a secondary communication, and which turned out to be not a list of the dead, but a list of the resonance signatures of the dead. The unique neural pattern of each individual who had been lost, preserved in the Veth resonance, record the way a voice was preserved in a recording. 712 human signatures. An unknown number of Veth. The negotiations took 8 months. The territorial framework was complex and would be revised 3 times in the following 5 years. Xenobiologists published 7 papers in rapid succession, all of which generated significant controversy in the academic community, which was how significant papers operated. The linguist published a monograph on the Veth vocal resonance system that the Veth themselves, through the contact channel, formally endorsed, the first formal Veth endorsement of a human academic work, which the xenobiologist who presented the original model found deeply gratifying and also slightly irritating. Marin filed one more report. It was not a long report. It said that the XENO medical contact, unsanctioned form still had a formatting error in Section 3B that someone should probably fix, and that she recommended the form be revised to include a category for outcomes that could not be anticipated at time of contact, and that she was available for follow-up consultation. She also requested a permanent assignment to the contact division, which was approved. On the day the ceasefire became a permanent framework, not peace, because peace was a thing that required more time and more work, and more of the slow institutional processes that Marin had learned to respect if not exactly to love. They came to the contact room for the last scheduled formal session. She brought the token. She set it on the floor between them, the way she had the first time. The geometric pattern caught the light. The warm amber cycled in her nodes. She made the vocalization. I see you. Marin hummed back. I see you too. Vay's manipulators found her hands. Both of them. The precise, locked value of the grip that Marin could have described in her sleep, that she sometimes felt the ghost of in the small hours, the particular warmth of contact across a physiological barrier that should have been insurmountable. They stayed like that for a long time. Not navigating anywhere, not broadcasting. Not disrupting anything or saving anything or being observed by anything except the monitoring room, which had, over 8 months and hundreds of sessions, quietly developed its own protocol for this particular part of the contact procedure. Everyone in the room put down their instruments and simply watched, not as scientists, not as military observers, just as the particular kind of witness that a moment requires when it is the kind of moment that should not go unwitnessed. Outside, the unnamed moon turned in the light of its distant star. Inside, a human woman and a Veth soldier sat with their hands together, in the contact room that still smelled of sealant, and held a frequency in common. The sound that answers is the sound that saves. It wasn't complicated. It never had been.